Hey y'all, and welcome back to Diary of a Real Estate Mom. So listen, one thing that I've learned on this whole journey of becoming a better version of myself, whether that's as a mom, a businesswoman, or just as a woman, period, is this. People will try to put you in a box long before you ever try to grow out of it. And see, they'll base that box off of who they think you are. Maybe it's because of the way you look, the way you carry yourself, your personality, your gender, your age. Or maybe it's because of who they're comfortable with you being, or who you used to be the last time they checked. And see, that's what I want to talk about today. Because some of the boxes that people put us in, we never even asked to be in.
Baby, you're perfect. Don't let no one tell you otherwise. That smile can give it the butterflies. Mesmerized by you.
You see, people will create a whole version of you in their mind and then have the audacity to get mad when you become anything outside of that. Some folks only know the you from 10 years ago, or the struggling you, or the hurting you, or the surviving version of you, And some only feel comfortable when you stay in that version of you. When you stay in the box that they decided you belong in. They like you predictable. They like you figured out. They like you when you play the role that makes them feel safe, when you're quiet, when you're easy to read, easy to manage, easy to underestimate, And if you're naturally soft-spoken or introverted like me, sometimes people assume they can run over you or control you or manipulate you, They mistake that silence for weakness, your kindness for naivete, your calmness for, oh, she green, she don't know no better, But here's the thing, the moment you start growing, evolving, and choosing yourself, you see, that's when rooms get quiet. Not because you're wrong, not even because you're changing too fast, but because you've simply outgrown the box that they tried to keep you in. People love to underestimate a woman that they assume won't speak up, won't walk away, won't evolve, won't grow past what they decided she was. But here's the part they don't expect. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Soft doesn't mean unaware. Being still is not the same as being stuck. And being humble does not mean that you're not confident or don't know your worth. And honestly, that's also why I've always loved rooting for the underdog. I love me a good underdog story, I swear. I'm a big movie and TV series binger, I don't like watching episodes live. I can't stand it, okay? Especially when it's a really good show. I like to let them stack up, and lock myself in my room for a whole weekend with nothing but snacks and a season worth of episodes to binge. See, that's my type of carrying on right there, you see. But look, some of my favorite underdog stories are real life ones, I love the movie King Richard about Venus and Serena, I love Will Smith when he played Chris Gardner in The Pursuit of Happiness. Or even Michael Jordan's story about how he didn't even make his high school basketball team at first. Or Oprah's story or Tyler Perry's story. I love hearing about those. And even the story of Jesus in the Bible. You see, when you study these stories, I notice there's a pattern. People who go the farthest they almost always start out being counted out or put in a box that they didn't ask to be in, and were later challenged to break out of that box. But you see, here's the flip side to that we don't talk about enough. You know, it's not just other people who box us in. Sometimes it's that person looking back at you in the mirror. You know, we box ourselves into old labels, old habits, old memories, old mistakes, old versions of who we were before we started healing, you know, before we started growing, before life took us through some experiences that taught us our greatest lessons. You know, we tell ourselves things like, I don't think I'm ready. You know, I'm too young for that. I'm too old for this. You know, nobody where I'm from has done this. Who I think I am. You know, what if I fail? Again, what if they judge me? What if they talk about me? What if I'm not enough? And what happens? We shrink. We shrink ourselves into the very box that we're trying to break out of. And don't get me wrong. Look, I'm not talking at you. I'm talking with you. See, I'm reminding myself of this too. You know, just because I'm sitting here talking about it does not mean that I haven't mastered by a long shot, okay? Because while I have climbed out of some boxes that people have put me in, I'm still learning how to break out of the boxes I've put myself in too. And look, stepping into a new version of yourself, it will always feel uncomfortable at first. You know, just like a pair of new shoes. You know what I'm saying? They tight at first. You know, the first time you wear them, they a little tight. They rub your heel a little bit. You know, they feel awkward. You know, they haven't been quite broken in yet. And then on top of that, you're gonna have the people who have their opinions about your shoes too. You know, they might see you in your new shoes. You know, like, oh, you know, I wouldn't wear those like that. I wouldn't wear it with that. I put this on with it, you know. Or you wearing those already? You know, well, they not this brand. They not that brand, you know. What are those? You know, what are those? But look, here's the caveat. God didn't make those shoes for their feet. They're not for their walk. They're not for their journey, their calling. You know, he made them for yours. And sometimes people will judge your shoes because they know if God asked them to carry what he's anointed you to do, they couldn't walk 10 steps in them if they wanted to. But look, here's the thing. The same way that you can't let people box you in, you can't keep boxing yourself in either. You know? You can't keep letting old fears block new seasons. You can't let old labels cancel out new levels. You can't let who you were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or even last year get in the way of who God is calling you to be today. Because look, at some point, you got to realize it's not about who's watching, you know, who's judging, who's clapping, who's not. It's about staying rooted in who you're becoming and walking the path that God called you, not them, to walk. Because look, when you rooted like that, you don't have to overly explain. You don't have to convince. You don't have to defend. Your peace becomes the proof. Your growth becomes the evidence. And your life starts telling the story for you without you even having to say a word. So, if you're in a season right now where you feel boxed in, you know, whether that's by people or by your own thoughts and doubts, look, this is a reminder. Break out anyway. Bust out that box anyway. Choose you anyway. Grow anyway. Become her anyway. And forget what anybody got to say about it. Because truth is, they going to talk anyway, and they probably already are. So do it in spite of. In spite of the negativity, in spite of the self-doubt, in spite of the gossip, in spite of the anxiety, in spite of the fear, do it anyway. Because God didn't create any of us to live in a box. You know, God is infinite. And he created all of us in his image, you know. He created us to create, to evolve, to expand, to think beyond the limits that people place on us and the limits we place on ourselves, you know. And the thing is, your evolution is connected to somebody else's breakthrough. Your becoming is part of God's bigger plan. So don't hide in a box that, quite frankly, you were never created to fit in the first place. So sis, I want to challenge you today. Step out that box. Whatever box you didn't choose, whatever box you've outgrown, whatever box you're ready to leave behind, I dare you. Step out of it. Now, if this resonated, drop a comment below and tell me what's one box that you're choosing to step out of this season. And if you haven't already, make sure you like this video, subscribe, turn those notifications on so you don't miss next week's episode, and make sure you share this with another woman who's breaking out of her box too. And if you're a real estate mama or agent that's ready to get organized and build your business like a CEO, look, my free agent bags checklist is linked in the description below. And when you download it, it also unlocks my closed day one kit, you guys. This is the exact system that I use to help agents run strong files from the first day under contract. Well, all right, guys, that's it for today's episode of Diary of a Real Estate Mom. If you stayed to the end, I truly, truly appreciate you and thank you for tuning in. I will see you in the next one. Bye.